And joining us now on the line from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Lorenzo Vidino. He is with the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and the author of Al-Qaeda in Europe, the New Battleground of Global Jihad. Buonasera, Lorenzo. Come va?
Buonasera. Good evening.
Okay,
good evening. Very good. Thanks for having me.
You've heard all my Italian. We're now switching to English. But since you're from Milan, I wanted to say a couple of words in Italian to you. I want to start by reading something that was in the National Interest, the magazine in the United States, and we'll start that as a kind of scene setter for our discussion. During 2009, at least 10 jihadi terrorist plots or related events came to light within our, meaning your American borders, an average of nearly one a month. By any metric, this is an unprecedented development. While many of the incidents involved clueless incompetence engaged in half-baked conspiracies, some of the plans alarmingly evidenced the influence of an identifiable terrorist command and control apparatus. And I guess I want to start, Lorenzo, by asking you, what do you think has changed in the last few years that has increased the number of attempted terrorist plots within the United States?
Well, I think we've seen increasing signs of radicalization in the United States, and I would think to some degree also in Canada. I think for a long time we've sort of had this mantra that radicalization was only taking place among some segments of the European Muslim community. Europeans were not really good at integrating their Muslim population, hence they had radicalization. And I think there's a lot of evidence out that that's not really the case, that there's the link between lack of integration and radicalization is not necessarily as straightforward as we thought it was, and this is the proof. Additionally, I think that we've seen some of these sort of homegrown, very amateurish, improvised clusters of radicalized individuals that have existed in the United States for a long time, being able to establish some sort of ties with serious professional groups, whether in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Yemen, or Somalia. And that link allows them to sort of build a certain level of knowledge, of expertise, that makes them a bit more professional, more serious than their predecessors, let's say 5 to 10 years ago. So these are sort of the two developments we've seen over the last year and a half.
Let me just go back to first principles with you, if I can, then, because the conventional wisdom is, I think you've correctly stated it, that Muslim immigrants are better integrated into the United States and Canada and are more welcomed here than they are in European countries. And I want to know, first of all, do you agree with that? Do you think that's true?
Oh, yeah, that is absolutely true. That is unquestionable. If we just look at just the sheer numbers, the average American Muslim individual is actually better educated than the average American. Double, actually most American Muslims actually go to college more than the average Americans. The income is significantly higher than the average American. So American Muslims tend to be, of course with exceptions, but tend to be middle to upper class. That is definitely not the case in Europe, where, of course, with exceptions, they tend to linger at the bottom of most statistics when it comes to education, unemployment, and so on. So that is definitely the case. What I think it's sort of the problem is that we tend to link integration when it comes to these socioeconomic factors to lack of radicalization. And that is disproven, I think, in all sorts of radicalism and terrorism, not just the Islamist one we're looking at. Going back, as you mentioned, I'm Italian of background. Most people that were involved in radical activities in the Red Brigades in the 1970s and then 80s were actually upper class, were coming from some of the wealthiest families in Italy. So no problems of socioeconomic disenfranchisement there. And I think that is the case in many of the individuals that we've seen involved with radical activities in the Middle East, in Europe, and in the United States.
Let me follow up then by reading some of your words back to you and sharing them with our viewers. This is from something you wrote last December called The Homegrown Terrorist Threat to the U.S. Homeland. The wave of arrests of the last months of 2009, you wrote, has contributed to shedding light on a reality that is significantly more nuanced, showing that radicalization affects some small segments of the American Muslim population exactly like it affects some fringe pockets of the Muslim population of each European country. Yet, despite this evidence, for a long time, the American authorities and commentators seemed unable to acknowledge the existence of radicalization among small segments of the American Muslim population. And I want to know why you think that is.
I think because for a long time there was this assumption that it had to do with integration. American Muslims do not pose those problems of integration that do exist in Europe. And I think there's always been this idea of lumping issues of integration with issues of radicalization. Never been the case. So not having these integration issues here in the United States, we thought that we wouldn't have issues of violent radicalization. It must be said, but also the number of people involved in violent activities in the United States was smaller than what it was in Europe. And the few ones that were involved, with a couple of exceptions, but for the most part were quite, as you said, quite amateurish, almost embarrassingly naive in their modus operandi. I think for these reasons, there was this sort of understanding that the threat was coming from the outside, whether it was the Middle East, whether it was from European Muslims, so carrying European passports and then coming to the United States. But American Muslims would not radicalize because they're well integrated. And I think the evidence kept sort of piling up over the last few years, and that's not the case.
You've got to permit this observation, I think, and that is that this is going to come as extremely distressing news to those who are watching this program who, fervently believe that all we've got to do is integrate as best we can Muslim immigrants into our society, and then so much of this terrorism threat will go away. You're telling us it's not the case. That's really quite hard to hear, don't you agree?
It's not necessarily the case. It's not the magic bullet. First of all, let me say that we're talking about a minority of a fringe. We're talking about statistically very small numbers. We're talking about maybe a couple of hundred people out of a population of 5 to 6 million. So let me make that clear. But secondly, you're right. I mean, I think that's the evidence is there. There's empirical evidence showing that most of the people involved in activities are well integrated. How would you explain, for example, the converts? We've seen quite a few individuals who have converted to Islam and then went to the most radical interpretation of Islam and have been involved in radical activities. There's no issue of integration there. There's no issue of socioeconomic challenges. It's just buying into an ideology that is radical and anti-American. 30 years ago, in all likelihood, some of his converts would have embraced some radical forms of, let's say, communism and would have joined groups like the Weather Underground. Or today, jihadi ideology can be, for some of his people, sort of the counter-narrative, the anti-system narrative that they embrace.
I guess you're talking in that case of somebody like Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and if the conventional wisdom is not a good explanation for why he did what he did as a convert, do you have an explanation for why that happens?
It is very difficult, to do a psychological analysis and have a complete picture. The radicalization path is very different from one case to the other. In some cases, there is a very deep theological analysis that leads an individual to embrace radical narrative that Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups espouse. In some cases, might be the case with Richard Reed, there isn't that deep of an analysis, but it's more that sense of adventure, that sense of belonging that some of these groups provide. Richard Reed was apparently an individual that had problems with the law, had problems with his family, and probably felt more embraced by this radical cluster in London that he joined up. And that the mission that Al-Qaeda gave him a purpose and a mission in life. So that could be one case, but in other cases it's really difficult to explain. We've had cases recently in the United States, what has been dubbed the Jihad Jane cases. 2 women who actually most people didn't even know they had actually converted to Islam. And in the time span of 4 or 5 months went from suburban soccer moms to radicals plotting an attack in Sweden, trying to kill a cartoonist in Sweden. That is very difficult to figure out. It's a very puzzling development.
Indeed. Okay, let's broaden the discussion somewhat and talk about this. How has terrorism, in your view, changed over the past, well, let's say decade since 9/11, in terms of who's actually doing it?
Well, if we just look at it from a Western perspective, Clearly the individuals involved in, and we're talking just of terrorism of sort of jihadist inspiration. We don't have to forget that actually statistically the largest number of terrorist activities come from non-Islamist groups. But I think it's fair to say that in the West, the largest and most significant threat comes from jihadist groups. And really the diversity of the people involved in these activities is quite staggering. You can't really profile people who are involved in these activities. They come from different races, different age groups, different nationalities, both sexes, all sorts of socioeconomic and educational backgrounds. It is really a very diverse picture, which makes it, of course, quite challenging for authorities.
This next question is, in some respects, a bit unfair because I'm going to ask you to comment on something that's been happening up here in our country. Last month, the government of Quebec, which is our province just to the east of here, where, of course, French is the first language, they introduced a bill in their legislature restricting access to public services for women who wanted to wear the Niqab. And I'm wondering whether you have any views on what effect that might have on encouraging or preventing radicalization.
It's a very tricky subject, because they did the Niqab, and and the veil in general. It's a debate that comes from Europe. I know it's also a big debate in Canada, particularly in the Francophone area. You can make both arguments, I think. One end, you're banning the Niqab clearly can make some individuals in the Muslim community feel stigmatized, as if their religion, in this case, would be sort of course, people who want to wear the niqab embrace a quite conservative interpretation of Islam. But anyways, their religion is under attack. Of course, the counter-argument to that is that the niqab is a garment that definitely goes sort of against Western values. And human rights. I think it's a very tricky debate, but my feeling is that we're really scratching the surface. It's a bit silly to focus on on a garment that is worn maybe by a few dozen, if not a few hundred people, but we're really not getting to the core of the problem, which is values, compatibility of certain interpretations of Islam, not of Islam itself, but of certain interpretations of Islam with Western values, and what Western values are. How much can we stretch them? I think those are the key issue, and we're sort of dancing around them with these niqab debates, which are taking place also in Europe.
Well, let's see if I can hit that nail harder on the head. What role do you think Muslim communities have to play in the West in order to prevent radicalization?
It's a huge debate taking place within Muslim community. I think there's an understanding that for a long time, Muslim communities have been sort of passive and not really addressing issues of radicalization that do unquestionably take place within their youth. That is changing. There are voices that are speaking out. There have been voices that have been speaking out for a long time. It is, of course, quite challenging. First of all, there's no such a thing as a Muslim community, as a homogeneous Unitarian Muslim community. Muslim communities in all Western countries are extremely diverse and fragmented along ethnic, sectarian, national origin, linguistic, and political lines. So huge fragmentation there, and some sub-communities are challenging radicalization head-on. Others are a bit more reluctant to really do something about it. But I think there's a growing understanding, I would say that's fair to say, of the United States and Canada as well, that it is a problem that is affecting the community, that something needs to be done. So I'm seeing a lot of activities at the grassroots level with organizations within Muslim communities addressing radicalization.
Let me ask you this one last thing in our last couple of minutes here. If the idea is to have nonviolent Islamists, and yes, there are nonviolent Islamists, playing a constructive role against radicalization, my question is, in the long run, is that irrelevant, since Islamist views are so antithetical to Western views anyway?
There's a short-term and long-term approach to radicalization. Some people believe that non-violent Islamists, so people who condemn violence yet have sort of a long-term aim of creating Islamic states worldwide, can help against the violent ones, against the Al-Qaeda. They possess the street credibility, the legitimacy to challenge the narrative of the violent ones. So we argue, proponents of this approach, should work with them against the violent ones. There's a potential there to be harnessed. Now, the counter-argument to that is that the long-term repercussions of this sort of engagement and partnership with non-violent Islamists are much greater than the potential in preventing terrorist attacks in the short term. Empowering Islamists, whether in this case the non-violent ones, has such a detrimental effect on social integration and social cohesion that it's sort of a suicidal, counterproductive move. And that's a debate. It depends what governments are prioritizing, if short-term security needs or long-term effects on integration and social cohesion. It's sort of tempting to go for the short-term fix and partnering with whoever can help us prevent a terrorist attack. But it's a fine line between engaging them and empowering their sort of vision, which I believe, and a lot of people believe, would have severe repercussions on the harmony of any multi-faith society.
Lorenzo, capisco e grazie mille. A presto.
Grazie a voi. Grazie a voi. Thank you very much.